The bloodied scratches on Jackson's arms reminded him why everyone called the lion cub unadoptable, yet something in those fierce amber eyes made him hand over 2/4 without hesitation. 60 days later, he stood frozen in disbelief as the once savage predator pressed against his leg and purred for the first time, shattering everything he thought he knew about wild animals. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jackson Steele wiped the sweat from his brow as the merciless Texas sun beat down on his shoulders. His ranch, the Broken Spur, wasn't much to look at, just a few hundred acres of stubborn soil that yielded more rocks than crops, a weathered barn that had seen better days, and a modest cabin he'd built with his own hands. But it was all his, earned through years of backbreaking work and determination that refused to bend even when everything else seemed determined to break. The drought had been particularly cruel this year. 3 months without decent rain had left the land parched and his cattle thin. Jackson had been forced to sell off half his herd just to keep the others fed, and the money from that sale was nearly gone. His muscles ached as he finished repairing the fence line that marked the eastern boundary of his property. At 35, Jackson was in his prime, 6'3" of solid muscle earned not from some fancy gym, but from the daily grind of ranch work. His broad shoulders and powerful arms were testament to a life lived by the strength of his hands. He was about to head back to the cabin when he noticed a cloud of dust in the distance. Visitors were rare out here, 20 miles from the nearest town. Jackson squinted against the sun, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver holstered at his hip. In these parts, caution wasn't paranoia, it was survival. As the vehicle drew closer, he recognized the beat-up blue pickup truck belonging to Emmett Wilson, an aging traveling salesman who occasionally passed through the area with oddities and necessities for the isolated ranchers and their families. Jackson relaxed slightly, but remained wary. Emmett was harmless enough, but he had a reputation for dealing in questionable merchandise. "Afternoon, Jackson," Emmett called out as he pulled his truck to a stop. The old man's face was a map of wrinkles carved by decades under the same unforgiving sun. "Thought I might find you out here mending fences. Seems like that's all a rancher ever does, ain't it? Mend what's broken." Jackson nodded but didn't smile. "What brings you out this way, Emmett? I don't have money for whatever you're selling." Emmett's eyes twinkled with the gleam of a born salesman. "Now, who says I'm selling anything? Maybe I just stopped by to check on my favorite hard-headed rancher." When Jackson's expression didn't change, Emmett chuckled. All right. Truth is, I've got something special this time, something you might be interested in." "Like I said, I'm broke." Jackson turned back toward his work, hoping the old man would take the hint. "Even you could afford this, son." Emmett climbed out of his truck with surprising agility for a man pushing 70. "Come take a look. Won't cost you but 4 bits. Curiosity got the better of Jackson, though he'd never admit it. He approached the truck as Emmett went around to the passenger side and opened the door. What Jackson saw inside made him freeze in his tracks. Crouched on the seat, contained in a makeshift cage fashioned from chicken wire, was a lion cub. It couldn't have been more than 3 months old, with golden fur and piercing eyes that locked onto Jackson with unmistakable ferocity. The cub bared its teeth and let out a sound that was part mule, part roar, a promise of the power it would one day possess. "What the hell, Emmett?" Jackson stepped back, his voice a mix of surprise and anger. "Where'd you get a lion cub? That's gotta be illegal." Emmett waved a dismissive hand. "That traveling circus that came through Oak Ridge last month, one of their lionesses had a litter. This little fellow was the runt, too aggressive for their liking. They were going to put him down, but I convinced them to let me take him off their hands." The cub swiped at the chicken wire, its claws already sharp enough to tear through flesh. There was something in its eyes, a defiance, a refusal to be cowed despite its circumstances. Jackson felt an unexpected connection to the wild creature. "And what exactly am I supposed to do with a lion cub?" Jackson asked, though he already felt himself being drawn in. Emmett shrugged. "Figured a man like you might appreciate a creature with some fight in him. This little guy's got spirit, just like you. Besides, he could keep the coyotes away from your livestock once he grows a bit, better than any guard dog." Jackson knew it was a terrible idea. He barely had enough to feed himself and his remaining cattle, let alone a predator that would eventually grow to over 400 pounds. But something about the cub's fierce determination, its refusal to show fear despite being caged and alone, struck a chord within him. 50 cents, Emmett repeated. "That's all I'm asking. Just enough for a cup of coffee in town." Against every rational thought, Jackson reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 quarters. "I must be out of my mind," he muttered as he handed the coins to Emmett. The old man's face split into a grin. "I knew you were the right man for this creature. You two are cut from the same cloth, too stubborn to know when you're beaten." He passed the makeshift cage to Jackson. "I'd wear gloves when you handle him. He's a biter." As if to confirm this assessment, the cub snarled and lunged against its confinement. "What's his name?" Jackson asked, already regretting his impulsive purchase. "Doesn't have one," Emmett replied as he climbed back into his truck. "That's your job now." With a wave and a cloud of dust, the old salesman was gone, leaving Jackson standing in his yard holding a cage with a creature that had no business being in Texas. The cub glared at him with golden eyes that held no gratitude, only challenge. Jackson stared back, matching its intensity. "Fury," he decided aloud. "That's what I'll call you, because that's all I see in those eyes." That night, Jackson set up a space in his barn for the cub, reinforcing a horse stall with additional wire and wood planks. He'd managed to get some raw meat from the freezer into a bowl, pushing it through the cage door quickly before the cub could take his fingers. Fury had snatched the meat with surprising speed, growling as he devoured it. "You and me," Jackson told the cub as he secured the stall, "we're both too stubborn for our own good, but at least one of us is supposed to be wild." As he walked back to his cabin under the vast Texas sky dotted with stars, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made a decision that would change everything. He just didn't know yet whether that change would be for better or worse. All he knew was that for 50 cents he'd bought himself a whole lot of trouble with teeth and claws. What he couldn't possibly know was how that trouble would transform his life in just 2 short months. The first week with Fury tested every ounce of Jackson's patience. The cub refused to be tamed, lunging at the rancher whenever he approached the makeshift enclosure. Those needle-sharp teeth had already drawn blood twice when Jackson's reflexes weren't quick enough. Each feeding was a battle of wills, Jackson using a long stick to push meat through the cage, while Fury snarled and clawed at the barrier between them. "You're the most ungrateful creature I've ever met," Jackson told the cub one morning as he pushed a bowl of water into the stall. Fury responded by swiping at his arm, barely missing the exposed skin. "And I've dealt with some ornery bulls in my time." Jackson hadn't told anyone about his unusual purchase. He knew what the reaction would be. His neighbors would think he'd lost his mind, and the authorities would likely confiscate the cub. There were laws against keeping exotic animals, especially dangerous predators. But something made him reluctant to give up on Fury, despite the daily struggle. Perhaps it was because Jackson recognized something of himself in the defiant cub, an unyielding spirit that refused to bend. Or maybe it was the simple fact that Fury was a survivor just like him. Either way, Jackson was determined to make this work, even if he wasn't entirely sure what this was supposed to be. On the 8th day, Jackson entered the barn to find Fury had somehow managed to break through part of the stall. The cub wasn't fully free. He'd gotten his head and one paw through the gap, but was stuck halfway through his escape attempt. Jackson froze, his heart hammering in his chest. This was the moment he'd been dreading, a direct confrontation with no barriers between them. Fury growled, struggling against the splintered wood that trapped him. There was fear in those fierce eyes now, mingled with the usual aggression. Jackson knew he had a choice. He could grab his rifle and end this experiment before it went any further, or he could risk those teeth and claws to help the cub. "Damn it all," he muttered, pulling on his thickest leather gloves. "You bite me again and we're done, you hear me?" Moving slowly, Jackson approached the trapped cub. Fury's growls intensified, but there was a note of panic in them now. The cub was exhausted from struggling, his golden fur damp with sweat. "Easy now," Jackson said, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm going to help you, whether you want it or not." With careful movements, he gripped the splintered wood and began to widen the gap. Fury swiped weakly at him, but seemed to understand on some level that Jackson was trying to help. After several tense minutes, the opening was wide enough for the cub to pull himself free. Jackson stepped back quickly, expecting Fury to attack. Instead, the cub collapsed onto the barn floor, panting heavily. He was still small enough that Jackson could have picked him up with one arm if the cub would have allowed it, which seemed unlikely. Fury eyed Jackson warily, but made no move to either flee or attack. For the first time since bringing the cub home, Jackson had a chance to really look at him without the barrier of the cage between them. Fury was thin, too thin, despite the meat Jackson had been providing. His golden coat was dull, and there was a small wound on his flank that hadn't been there before, likely from his escape attempt. "You're not doing so well, are you?" Jackson said softly. The cub's ears flicked at the sound of his voice. Moving with deliberate slowness, Jackson went to the corner of the barn where he kept a first aid kit for his livestock. He returned with antiseptic and some clean cloths. Fury watched him with suspicious eyes, but remained where he was, too exhausted to move. "This is going to sting," Jackson warned as he dampened a cloth with antiseptic. "But I don't need you getting an infection on top of everything else." As the cloth touched the wound, Fury let out a pained yelp and snapped at Jackson's hand. But the bite lacked the previous ferocity. It was more warning than attack. Jackson persisted, cleaning the wound as quickly as he could while avoiding those teeth. When he finished, Jackson sat back on his heels, watching the cub. Fury was watching him too, with an expression that seemed almost puzzled, as if he couldn't quite figure out what Jackson was. "You and me both, little one," Jackson said, answering the unspoken question. "I don't know what we're doing either." That night, instead of rebuilding the damaged stall, Jackson made a decision that even he recognized as foolhardy. He created a comfortable bed of straw in one corner of the barn and placed a bowl of fresh meat and a bowl of water nearby. Then he left the barn door slightly ajar, enough for a small cub to slip through if he chose to. "Your choice," he told Fury before heading back to his cabin. "Stay or go." Jackson barely slept that night, half expecting to hear the screams of his chickens being slaughtered by an escaped predator. But the night remained quiet. When dawn broke, he approached the barn with trepidation, not knowing what he would find. Fury was still there, curled up in the straw bed. The meat was gone and the water bowl was empty. The cub lifted his head as Jackson entered, ears alert, but he didn't growl. "Well, I'll be damned," Jackson said softly. "You decided to stay." It wasn't friendship, not by a long shot, but it was a beginning. Over the next few days, Jackson maintained this new arrangement. He would leave food and water in the barn, and Fury would remain there by choice. The cub still kept his distance, still growled when Jackson came too close, but the murderous intent seemed to have diminished somewhat. By the end of the second week, Jackson was able to sit on a hay bale across from Fury's corner without the cub retreating or showing signs of aggression. They would watch each other in silence, two solitary creatures sharing space without fully understanding why. "You need to put on some weight," Jackson told the cub as he observed Fury's still too thin frame. "Can't have people thinking I don't feed you properly." As if to acknowledge this concern, Fury began to eat more regularly. His coat started to regain its luster, and the wound on his flank healed cleanly. He was growing too, adding muscle and length at a rate that both impressed and concerned Jackson. In another month, the cub would be too large for the current arrangement to remain safe. "What am I going to do with you when you're full grown?" Jackson asked one evening as he watched Fury devour a rabbit he'd hunted that morning. The cub looked up briefly from his meal, blood staining his muzzle, offering no answers. The question haunted Jackson as he went about his daily chores. The drought continued, forcing him to dig deeper wells to water his remaining cattle. Money was tighter than ever, and the extra meat needed to feed a growing predator was an expense he could ill afford. Yet each day, he found himself looking forward to those quiet moments in the barn with Fury, that strange, silent companionship that had developed between them. 3 weeks into their uneasy coexistence, Jackson woke to the sound of rain hammering against his cabin roof. He lay in bed for a moment, savoring the precious sound. After months of drought, the parched earth would finally drink its fill. His cattle would have fresh grass, and perhaps his fortunes would turn with the weather. Lightning flashed, illuminating his sparse bedroom, followed almost immediately by a thunderclap that shook the windows. Jackson thought of Fury alone in the barn and felt an unexpected pang of concern. The cub had never experienced a Texas thunderstorm before. Cursing himself for his sentimentality, Jackson pulled on his boots and raincoat. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the deluge. The rain came down in sheets, instantly soaking him despite his protective gear. The short distance to the barn felt like a mile as he slogged through mud already forming in the yard. When he reached the barn and pushed open the door, the beam of his flashlight caught two glowing eyes in the corner. Fury was pressed against the wall, his body trembling with each thunderclap. The cub's fierce demeanor had vanished, replaced by primal fear. "It's just noise," Jackson said, closing the door behind him. "Nothing to be afraid of." He set the flashlight on a shelf, pointing it upward to create ambient light in the barn. Then he settled onto his usual hay bale, a respectful distance from the frightened cub. Another crack of thunder made Fury flinch, a small whimper escaping his throat. Jackson didn't approach. He knew better than to corner a frightened predator, even a young one. Instead, he began to talk, his deep voice steady against the storm's fury. "My daddy used to say that thunder was just the sky clearing its throat," he said, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Said the earth needed reminding now and then that it wasn't in charge." The cub's eyes remained fixed on him, ears flattened against his head. But as Jackson continued to speak, telling stories of other storms he'd weathered, he noticed Fury's trembling gradually subsiding. Whether it was the sound of his voice or simply the cub becoming accustomed to the thunder, Jackson couldn't say. But by the time he'd talked himself hoarse, Fury had relaxed enough to curl up on his straw bed, though his eyes remained alert. "Guess I'll stay a while," Jackson said, leaning back against a support beam, "just to make sure the roof doesn't leak." He didn't intend to fall asleep, but the sound of rain and the day's exhaustion soon pulled him under. When he woke hours later, the storm had passed and dawn light filtered through the barn's high windows. Jackson sat up, grimacing at the stiffness in his neck from sleeping upright. Then he froze. Fury wasn't in his corner. A soft weight against his boot made him look down. The cub was curled up against his feet, fast asleep. Jackson hardly dared breathe, afraid any movement would break this unexpected moment of trust. Carefully, moving with glacial slowness, he reached down and extended his hand, stopping just short of touching the cub's fur. Fury's eyes opened, instantly alert. Their gazes locked, and Jackson waited for the growl, the snap, the retreat. But the cub simply regarded him with those amber eyes. neither retreating nor advancing. After a long moment, Fury stretched, his paw brushing against Jackson's outstretched fingers in what might have been accidental contact. Jackson's heart hammered in his chest. It wasn't exactly affection, but it was far from the aggression that had defined their relationship until now. "Well, good morning to you too," he said softly. That morning marked a turning point. Fury didn't suddenly transform into a loving pet. He remained wild, unpredictable, dangerous. But something had shifted. The cub began to follow Jackson around the barn, maintaining a careful distance but clearly interested in the rancher's activities. When Jackson worked on repairing tack or sorting tools, Fury would watch from a few feet away, his eyes tracking every movement. By the end of the 4th week, Jackson dared to try something he'd been considering for days. He brought a piece of rope into the barn, not to restrain the cub, but to see if he might play. He dangled it from his fingers, moving it like a snake across the barn floor. Fury eyed it suspiciously at first. Then, when the end flicked near his paw, his predatory instincts kicked in. The cub pounced, capturing the rope end and rolling onto his back to kick at it with his hind legs. Jackson couldn't help but laugh at the display, this fierce predator playing like an oversized house cat. The sound of his laughter seemed to startle Fury, who immediately released the rope and retreated a few steps, eyeing Jackson warily. But when the rancher resumed moving the rope, the cub's play instinct won out over caution. Soon they had established a game, with Jackson dragging the rope and Fury stalking and pouncing on it. "You're getting faster," Jackson told the cub after a particularly impressive leap. "Going to be a real hunter someday." The reminder of Fury's true nature sobered him. The cub was growing rapidly, adding muscle and weight each day. His paws were enormous, a sign of the size he would eventually reach. The playful moments were precious, but Jackson couldn't afford to forget what Fury was and would become. As if reading his thoughts, Fury abandoned the rope and approached Jackson directly, moving with the fluid grace of a born predator. The rancher held still, unsure of the cub's intentions. Fury stopped just inches away, closer than he'd ever willingly come before. Then, with deliberate movements, the cub sniffed at Jackson's hand, his whiskers tickling the rancher's skin. "Well, I'll be," Jackson whispered, hardly daring to move. After a thorough investigation, Fury surprised him further by butting his head against Jackson's palm, not hard, just enough to make contact. Then he returned to his corner, as if nothing unusual had happened, leaving Jackson staring at his hand in wonder. That night in his cabin, Jackson researched lions on his battered old laptop, connected to spotty satellite internet that cost more than he could afford. He learned that male lions could grow to over 400 pounds, with powerful jaws capable of crushing bone. They were social creatures in the wild, living in prides with complex hierarchies and behaviors. A solitary male was rare and often dangerous, driven by competing needs for territory and mates. Jackson scrolled through page after page, absorbing information about diets, behaviors, lifespans. One fact stood out starkly: lions in captivity lived shorter, more stressed lives than their wild counterparts, unless their conditions were exceptional. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself, closing the laptop. "He doesn't belong here." But when he went to the barn the next morning, Fury greeted him with what could only be described as enthusiasm, trotting over to inspect Jackson's boots and pants as if checking to make sure he was the same human as yesterday. "Gotta figure something out for you," Jackson told the cub as he set down a larger portion of meat than usual. "Can't keep you in a barn forever." Fury's only response was to tear into his breakfast with typical gusto, blood staining his growing mane. Jackson watched him eat, troubled by the knowledge that their current arrangement had an expiration date, one that was approaching faster than he'd anticipated. By the 5th week, Fury had become Jackson's shadow, The cub followed him from the barn to the cabin porch, watching intently as the rancher went about his daily chores. Jackson had built a simple enclosure attached to the barn, not a cage, but a fenced area where Fury could feel the sun on his fur and the grass beneath his paws while remaining safely contained when Jackson couldn't supervise him. The rain had transformed the landscape. Where there had been dust and withered vegetation, now green shoots pushed through the earth. Jackson's cattle grew stronger on the fresh grass, and the ranch seemed to breathe again after months of holding its breath against the drought. "See that?" Jackson said to Fury one morning, gesturing toward the greening pastures. "That's what hope looks like." The cub stretched lazily in the sun, his golden coat gleaming. He was growing at an astonishing rate, no longer the skinny runt that Emmett had delivered. His shoulders were broadening, his legs lengthening, and the beginnings of a mane were appearing around his neck. When he yawned, his teeth flashed white and dangerous in the sunlight. Jackson's concerns about Fury's future hadn't diminished, but they had been temporarily pushed aside by the surprising joy he found in the cub's company. For a man who had lived alone for most of his adult life, the presence of another living creature that seemed genuinely interested in him was a novel experience. "Don't get too comfortable," Jackson warned himself as much as the cub. "This isn't permanent." Yet each day, the bond between them strengthened. Fury had begun to respond to his name, head tilting when Jackson called him. He permitted touch now, brief strokes along his back or scratches behind his ears. The cub still retained his wild spirit, still had moments of aggression when something startled him, but the murderous intent that had marked their early days together had faded. It was during the 6th week that trouble arrived in the form of Nathan Blackwood, owner of the neighboring Circle B ranch, and a man who had made no secret of his desire to absorb the broken spur into his own holdings. Jackson was repairing a section of the enclosure when he heard the distinctive rumble of Blackwood's luxury SUV coming up the drive. "Stay quiet," he told Fury, who had retreated to the barn at the sound of the approaching vehicle. Whether the cub understood the words or merely sensed Jackson's tension was unclear, but he remained out of sight. Blackwood was a man of 50, with the soft hands and hard eyes of someone who had inherited wealth rather than earned it. He stepped from his vehicle wearing a pristine white Stetson and boots that had clearly never seen a day's honest work. "Steele," he called, approaching with the false camaraderie of a politician. "Place is looking better after the rain. Almost respectable." Jackson didn't bother with pleasantries. "What do you want, Blackwood?" The older man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just being neighborly. Heard you had to sell off half your herd last month. Thought I'd check if you were ready to be sensible about my offer." The offer had been insultingly low, less than half what the broken spur was worth, even in its current state. Jackson had refused it without a second thought. "Nothing's changed," Jackson said firmly. "This land isn't for sale." Blackwood's smile tightened. "Everything's for sale at the right price, or under the right pressure." He gestured toward the withered crops in Jackson's small field. "One good rain doesn't change the fact that you're barely hanging on here. The bank tells me you're 3 months behind on your mortgage." Anger flared in Jackson's chest, both at the invasion of his privacy and at the truth of Blackwood's words. He was indeed struggling to keep the ranch afloat. But the broken spur had been his father's dream, passed down to him with the expectation that he would preserve it. Selling to a man like Blackwood, who saw the land only in terms of profit margins, was unthinkable. "My finances aren't your concern," Jackson said coldly, "and I'd appreciate if you'd stop trying to bribe bank managers for my personal information." Blackwood shrugged, unapologetic. "Just good business. Speaking of which," he paused, his attention caught by something beyond Jackson's shoulder. "What in God's name is that?" Jackson turned to see Fury standing in the doorway of the barn, drawn perhaps by the tension in Jackson's voice. The cub's stance was alert, suspicious, his amber eyes fixed on the stranger. "Got yourself a pet lion?" Blackwood's voice held a mixture of disbelief and calculation. "That's illegal in this county, Steele. Hell, it's illegal in most of the state." "He's not a pet," Jackson said, though he wasn't sure what else to call Fury. Blackwood's expression turned sly. Wildlife Conservation Department would be mighty interested to hear about this. Keeping an exotic predator without permits, that's a hefty fine, maybe even jail time. The threat hung in the air between them. Jackson knew Blackwood was right. He had no legal right to keep Fury. The authorities would confiscate the cub, and Jackson would face penalties he couldn't afford. "What do you want?" Jackson asked, though he already knew the answer. "Same as before, your land at my price." Blackwood gestured toward Fury, who had begun to growl low in his throat, sensing the hostility in the air. "Or I make a call about your little zoo operation here." Jackson's mind raced. He could refuse, call Blackwood's bluff, but it wasn't a bluff. The man would absolutely report him, if only out of spite. He could agree to sell, surrender his heritage and his future for a fraction of its value, or he could find another solution, one that neither of them had considered yet. "I need time," he said finally. "Give me 2 weeks to think about it." Blackwood seemed surprised by the lack of immediate resistance. "1 week," he countered, "and then I expect an answer, or I start making calls." He glanced again at Fury, who had moved to stand beside Jackson, fur bristling. "Better decide what matters more to you, this worthless piece of land or staying out of trouble." As Blackwood drove away, dust billowing behind his expensive vehicle, Jackson looked down at Fury. The cub was pressed against his leg, still growling softly in the direction of the departing intruder. "You sensed he was trouble, didn't you?" Jackson said, absently stroking the cub's growing mane. "Smart boy." But Blackwood's visit had forced the issue Jackson had been avoiding. Fury couldn't stay, not legally, not safely, not permanently. The cub deserved a life suited to his nature, not confined to a ranch enclosure, until he inevitably grew too large and dangerous to manage. That night, Jackson searched the internet again, this time looking for wildlife sanctuaries that might take in a lion cub. Most were full, underfunded, or too far away to be practical. But one, located about 6 hours' drive from the ranch, showed promise. Wild Heart Sanctuary specialized in big cats rescued from illegal private ownership or defunct circuses. Their website showed spacious enclosures designed to mimic natural habitats, with trained staff who understood the needs of large predators. Jackson sent an email explaining his situation, omitting the fact that he had purchased Fury from a traveling salesman and instead claiming he had found the abandoned cub on his property. It wasn't entirely dishonest. Fury had indeed been abandoned in a sense, left with a stranger who had no business caring for a wild animal. As he hit send, Jackson felt a heaviness in his chest that took him by surprise. The thought of parting with Fury hurt more than he had expected. Somehow, in just 6 weeks, the fierce little cub had carved out a place in his solitary life, a place Jackson hadn't known was empty until now. The response from Wild Heart Sanctuary came 2 days later. The director, Dr. Elena Cortez, expressed interest in Fury's case but wanted more information: photographs, details about his behavior, eating habits, and his interactions with humans. She also warned that the sanctuary was operating at near capacity and that proper assessment would be necessary before they could commit to taking him. Jackson spent an hour composing his reply, surprised by his reluctance to present Fury's case too convincingly. Each positive attribute he listed: Fury's improving temperament, his growing comfort with human contact, his playful nature, felt like another reason to keep the cub, not send him away. Still, he attached several recent photos showing Fury's size and condition and hit send with a heaviness in his chest. That afternoon, he sat on the porch steps, watching Fury explore the yard. The cub had been permitted increasingly supervised freedom, as his behavior became more predictable. He was investigating a beetle crawling across the dirt, batting at it gently with his paw in a display of precision that belied his growing strength. "You're not made for this place," Jackson said aloud, though the admission pained him. "You need more space, more of your own kind." Fury looked up at the sound of Jackson's voice, then abandoned the beetle to trot over to the porch. Without hesitation, the cub butted his head against Jackson's knee in what had become a familiar greeting. Jackson scratched behind Fury's ears, marveling at how much had changed in just 6 weeks. The vicious cub that had once tried to take his hand off now leaned into his touch with something like contentment. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Jackson told him. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Time's ticking, Steele. 5 days left. NB." Jackson deleted the message with a scowl. Blackwood's threat hung over him like a storm cloud, darkening his thoughts whenever he considered his options. He could fight, try to get emergency permits, claim Fury as a rescue case, argue that moving him would be detrimental to his well-being. But those were battles he was unlikely to win, especially against someone with Blackwood's connections and resources. The next morning brought another email from Dr. Cortez. She had reviewed Fury's photos and information and believed the sanctuary could accommodate him. However, she warned that the transition wouldn't be easy. Fury would need to be gradually introduced to other lions, a process that could take months and might never result in full socialization, given his unusual upbringing. "While we can provide expert care and appropriate habitat," she wrote, "you should understand that animals raised with intense human contact often struggle to adapt to more natural environments. Your lion appears to have formed a significant attachment to you, which is both unusual given his species and potentially problematic for his future adjustment." Jackson read the email twice, focusing on that last sentence. A significant attachment. Was that what had developed between them? He had always framed their relationship as temporary, a necessary arrangement until a better solution could be found. But watching Fury now sprawled in a patch of sunlight, occasionally glancing up to check Jackson's location, it was hard to deny that some kind of bond had formed. As if to underscore the point, when Jackson stood to refill his coffee, Fury immediately rose and followed him into the cabin. The cub had only recently been allowed indoors, and he moved through the space with cautious curiosity, sniffing at furniture and investigating corners. He seemed particularly fascinated by Jackson's worn leather armchair, circling it several times before finally jumping up and settling himself on the cushion with a contented sigh. "That's my spot," Jackson said, though he made no move to displace the cub. Fury responded by stretching luxuriously, taking up even more of the chair's surface. His eyes drifted closed, seemingly perfectly at home in this human dwelling. The sight stirred something in Jackson's chest, a warmth that had become increasingly familiar over the past weeks. It was dangerously close to affection, to the kind of attachment that would make the inevitable separation all the more painful. He replied to Dr. Cortez's email, agreeing to bring Fury to the sanctuary for assessment in 1 week's time, conveniently the same deadline Blackwood had given him. Whatever happened with the ranch, at least Fury would have a chance at a better life among his own kind. That night, a spring storm rolled across the ranch, not the gentle rain they'd had before, but a violent tempest with cracking lightning and window-rattling thunder. Jackson had left the cabin door ajar so Fury could retreat to the barn if he chose, but the cub made no move to leave. Instead, he pressed closer to Jackson's legs as they sat on the floor near the fireplace, the cub's body trembling slightly with each thunderclap. "Still not a fan of storms, huh?" Jackson said, running a hand along Fury's back. "Can't say I blame you. They were my daddy's favorite, though. He'd sit right here and watch them roll in. Said it reminded him that there were still things in this world bigger than human problems." As the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, Jackson prepared for bed. Fury watched his nighttime routine with interest, following him from room to room as if afraid to be left alone with the thunder. When Jackson finally climbed under the covers, he expected the cub to return to his spot by the fire or perhaps retreat to the barn as the storm subsided. Instead, with a single fluid leap, Fury jumped onto the foot of the bed. The cub turned in a circle twice, then settled against Jackson's legs with a heavy sigh. Jackson froze, unsure how to respond to this new level of familiarity. "This isn't going to work when you're 400 pounds, he said finally. Fury's only response was to close his eyes, apparently having found his preferred sleeping arrangement. His weight was warm and oddly comforting against Jackson's legs. For a man who had slept alone for most of his adult life, the presence of another living creature, even a potentially dangerous one, brought an unexpected sense of peace. Jackson knew he should discourage this behavior. The sanctuary wouldn't approve of a lion cub that thought it belonged on furniture, much less in bed with humans. But as the storm raged outside and Fury's breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep, he couldn't bring himself to disturb the moment. "Just for tonight," he told himself, reaching down to stroke the cub's fur once more before turning out the light. But in the morning, when he woke to find Fury still curled against him, now stretched along his side with one paw draped across his chest in an almost protective gesture, Jackson knew he had crossed a line that couldn't easily be redrawn. Somehow, against all odds and his better judgment, he had let this wild creature become important to him. The realization was both wonderful and terrible. Wonderful because it had been so long since Jackson had allowed himself to care deeply about anything beyond mere survival. Terrible because in less than a week, he would have to give Fury up forever. 4 days before Blackwood's deadline, Jackson received another visitor, this one unexpected and unwelcome. The county sheriff, Dale Mercer, pulled up in his patrol car just as Jackson was finishing his morning chores. Fury was safely in the barn, but Jackson's pulse quickened nonetheless. Had Blackwood already made good on his threat? "Morning, Jackson," the sheriff said, stepping from his vehicle. Dale was in his 60s, a fixture in the county for as long as Jackson could remember. They weren't friends exactly, but there was a mutual respect between them. Dale had known Jackson's father, had helped look after the younger Steele when he first inherited the ranch. "Sheriff?" Jackson nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral. "What brings you out this way?" Dale removed his hat, running a hand through thinning gray hair. "Got a call yesterday, anonymous tip about some kind of exotic animal being kept out here." His eyes were shrewd, watching Jackson's reaction. "Any idea what that might be about?" So Blackwood had jumped the gun, using the threat rather than waiting for Jackson's decision. It was a miscalculation on the wealthy rancher's part. Jackson responded better to direct confrontation than to manipulation. "I might," Jackson admitted, seeing no point in lying to a man who could simply demand to search the property. "Better show you." He led Dale to the barn, speaking quietly as they walked. He was going to be put down. "I've been looking for a sanctuary that can take him, got one lined up for next week." Dale's eyebrows rose as Jackson pushed open the barn door. Fury was lounging on a hay bale, but instantly came to alert at the sight of a stranger. The cub backed up, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Dale breathed. "That's a lion." "His name is Fury," Jackson said, moving to stand beside the cub, a hand resting lightly on his growing mane. The touch seemed to reassure Fury, who stopped growling but kept his eyes fixed warily on the sheriff. "You know I can't let this slide, Jackson," Dale said, though his tone was regretful rather than threatening. "It's illegal to keep predators like this without proper permits and facilities." "I know." Jackson had anticipated this moment from the day he'd handed Emmett those 2 quarters. "Like I said, I've got arrangements to take him to Wild Heart Sanctuary on Monday. Dr. Cortez is expecting us." Dale considered this, his weathered face thoughtful. "Elena Cortez? I know her work. She's good people." He studied Fury, noting how the cub leaned slightly against Jackson's leg. "He seems attached to you." "It's complicated," Jackson admitted. "I bet it is." Dale sighed, replacing his hat. "Here's what we're going to do. You've got until Monday to get that animal to the sanctuary. I'll call Dr. Cortez myself to confirm the arrangement, but if that cat is still here Tuesday morning, I'll have to confiscate him and you'll face charges. Clear?" Relief washed over Jackson. It wasn't a reprieve. Fury would still have to go, but at least he had until their planned departure date. "Clear. Thank you, Dale." The sheriff nodded, turning to leave, then paused. Was it Blackwood who called it in? Jackson's silence was answer enough. "Thought so," Dale said. "That man's been trying to push out smaller ranchers for years. Just a word of advice. Whatever he's holding over you, don't let him win. Your daddy would have fought tooth and nail for this place." After Dale left, Jackson returned to Fury, who seemed to sense his troubled mood. The cub pushed his head against Jackson's hand, demanding attention in the way that had become familiar over the past weeks. "That was close," Jackson told him, scratching beneath his chin, "but we got a reprieve, few more days together before—" He couldn't finish the sentence. That afternoon, Jackson received a call from Dr. Cortez herself, confirming Monday's appointment and discussing the logistics of transporting Fury safely. The conversation was professional but kind. She seemed to understand the difficulty of Jackson's position without explicitly acknowledging the emotional aspect. "We'll take good care of him," she assured him. "He's young enough that he should adapt well to our environment, especially with proper introduction to other cubs his age." "He's not good with strangers," Jackson warned, "and he gets scared during thunderstorms." There was a pause on the line. "Mr. Steele," Dr. Cortez said gently, "I understand this is difficult, but you should prepare yourself for the reality that Fury will need to develop new behaviors and attachments at the sanctuary. The bond you formed, while remarkable, isn't something we can or should try to replicate." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. Of course she was right. Fury needed to be a lion, not a companion to a lonely rancher. But the thought of the cub forgetting him, forming new attachments, living a life where Jackson was no longer relevant, it hurt more than he had expected. "I understand," he said finally. That night, as had become their routine, Fury joined Jackson on the bed. The cub was now large enough that his weight made the old mattress sag in the middle, creating a depression that inevitably drew them together as they slept. Jackson had given up pretending this wasn't their new normal, despite knowing it would make the coming separation even harder. 3 more nights, he told Fury, as he turned out the light. "Make 'em count." The next day brought another text from Blackwood. "Sheriff tells me you've got until Monday. Smart move, Steele. My offer still stands if you change your mind." Jackson deleted it without responding. If Blackwood thought losing Fury would break him, make him more willing to sell the ranch, he was mistaken. If anything, the threat had hardened Jackson's resolve to keep the broken spur, to make it thrive in spite of the odds against him. He spent the weekend making preparations, both for Fury's departure and for the ranch's future. He reinforced the carrier Dr. Cortez had recommended for transport, lined it with Fury's favorite blanket, and practiced having the cub enter it for short periods. To his surprise, Fury seemed to accept the new space without much resistance, perhaps sensing Jackson's determination that this was necessary. For the ranch, Jackson drafted plans for improvements he could make with limited resources, repairs to the irrigation system that would maximize the benefit of future rainfall, modifications to the cattle pens to reduce feed waste, a small greenhouse where he could extend the growing season for vegetables. They were modest ambitions, but they represented a future. His future on this land, with or without Fury. Sunday evening arrived with painful swiftness. Jackson prepared a special meal for Fury. Fresh venison he'd hunted that morning, served raw the way the cub preferred. As they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jackson found himself talking to Fury as if the cub could understand every word. "You're going to be okay," he said, as much to convince himself as anything else. "The sanctuary has other lions, space to run, people who know how to care for you properly. It's what you need, even if it's not what either of us wants right now." Fury leaned against his leg, seemingly content in the moment, unaware of the changes tomorrow would bring. Jackson ran his hand along the cub's back, memorizing the feel of his fur, the solid weight of him, the quiet rumble that wasn't quite a purr but conveyed satisfaction nonetheless. "And I'll be okay too," Jackson continued, though the words felt hollow. "I've been alone before. I can do it again." Monday morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of perfect spring day that usually lifted Jackson's spirits. Today it felt like a cruel joke, perfect weather for the worst day he'd faced in years. He'd barely slept, spending most of the night with his hand resting on Fury's flank, feeling the steady rise and fall of the cub's breathing. The carrier sat by the door, ready for its reluctant passenger. Jackson had packed his old pickup with supplies for the journey: water, food for himself, fresh meat for Fury, blankets in case they needed to stop overnight. The drive to Wild Heart Sanctuary would take about 6 hours if the traffic was good, longer if they encountered problems. "Time to go, buddy," Jackson said, his voice rough with emotion he refused to fully acknowledge. Fury seemed to sense something was different. The cub paced the cabin restlessly, alternating between pressing close to Jackson and peering out the windows as if searching for whatever was causing his human's distress. When Jackson finally opened the carrier door and gestured for Fury to enter, the cub balked, backing away with a soft growl. "Don't make this harder," Jackson pleaded. "Please." It took nearly 30 minutes and a trail of meat pieces to coax Fury into the carrier. The click of the door latch closing felt unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. Fury immediately began pawing at the door, making distressed sounds that tore at Jackson's resolve. "It's okay," he soothed, kneeling beside the carrier. "I'm right here, not going anywhere without you." The drive began in tense silence, broken only by Fury's occasional protests from the carrier secured in the truck bed. Jackson had covered it with a tarp to protect the cub from wind and sun, leaving enough openings for proper ventilation. Every few miles he checked the rearview mirror, irrationally afraid that Fury might somehow escape or disappear if he didn't keep constant watch. An hour into the journey, Jackson pulled over at a rest stop to check on Fury and offer him water. The cub had settled somewhat, no longer pawing at the carrier door, but watching Jackson with wary eyes that seemed to ask what he had done wrong to deserve this confinement. "Just a few more hours," Jackson told him, reaching through the carrier bars to stroke Fury's head. "Then you'll have more space than you know what to do with." They continued on, leaving the familiar territory of their county behind and heading east toward the sanctuary. The landscape changed gradually, the dry rangelands giving way to more wooded areas as they approached the eastern part of the state. Jackson drove mechanically, his mind not on the road, but on what awaited them at their destination. What would Fury's life be like at the sanctuary? Would he adapt quickly to his new surroundings, or would he spend days looking for Jackson, confused by his absence? Would the other lions accept him, or would his unusual upbringing mark him as an outsider? These questions circled endlessly, each one more painful than the last. Midway through the journey, dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. Jackson frowned, checking the weather app on his phone at the next stop. A severe storm warning had been issued for the counties they still needed to traverse. He considered pulling over to wait it out, but dismissed the idea. Better to push through and reach the sanctuary before the worst hit. The rain started as a gentle patter, but quickly intensified into a downpour that reduced visibility to mere yards. Jackson slowed the truck, gripping the wheel tightly as gusts of wind buffeted the vehicle. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that shook the air around them. From the carrier came a sound Jackson had never heard before. Not a growl or a roar, but a high-pitched keen of pure fear. The storm had triggered Fury's deepest anxiety, and now the cub was trapped, unable to seek comfort as he had during previous storms. "It's okay," Jackson called over the drumming rain, knowing Fury couldn't hear him. "Just a storm. We're okay." The keening continued, rising in pitch until it was almost a scream. Jackson couldn't bear it. At the next exit, he pulled off the highway and found a deserted picnic area beneath a stand of trees. The rain was still pouring down, but the overhanging branches offered some minimal protection. Without hesitation, Jackson jumped out of the truck and rushed to the back. He was soaked within seconds, his clothes clinging to his skin as he fumbled with the carrier door. When it finally opened, Fury exploded out of the confinement, leaping directly into Jackson's arms with such force that he staggered backward. The cub's claws dug into Jackson's shoulders as he clung to the only security he knew, trembling violently with each thunderclap. Jackson held him close, ignoring the rain, the scratches, everything except the terrified creature in his arms. "I've got you," he murmured, his face pressed against Fury's damp fur. "I've got you." They stayed like that for several minutes, rain pouring down around them, until Fury's trembling began to subside. The cub's grip on Jackson's shoulders loosened slightly, though he made no move to release him completely. Jackson knew he had made a critical mistake. Dr. Cortez had warned him about reinforcing behaviors that the sanctuary would have to undo, behaviors like seeking human comfort during storms. But in that moment, with Fury's heart hammering against his chest, Jackson couldn't bring himself to care about proper protocols or what was best in the long term. All that mattered was easing the cub's fear now. Eventually, the worst of the storm passed, leaving behind a steady rain that seemed likely to continue for hours. Jackson gently tried to disengage Fury's claws from his shoulders, intending to return him to the carrier for the remainder of their journey. But the cub resisted, growling softly and tightening his grip. "We have to go," Jackson said, attempting to sound firm despite the lump in his throat. "They're expecting us." After a brief struggle that left Jackson with several new scratches, he managed to get Fury back into the carrier. The cub's betrayed expression as the door closed again felt like a knife to Jackson's heart. They resumed their journey, the truck's windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the persistent rain. Jackson's soaked clothes clung uncomfortably to his skin, but he barely noticed the discomfort. His mind was too occupied with doubts that grew stronger with each passing mile. Was he doing the right thing? Would Fury truly be better off among strangers who didn't understand his fears, his habits, his personality? The sanctuary might provide proper habitat and expert care, but would they sit with him during thunderstorms, know exactly where he liked to be scratched, recognize the difference between his playful growl and his warning one? As the truck crested a hill, the GPS announced they were only 30 minutes from their destination. Jackson's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. 30 minutes until he had to say goodbye to the most unlikely friend he'd ever made. Wild Heart Sanctuary was nestled in a heavily wooded area, set back from the main road behind an imposing iron gate. A sign bearing the sanctuary's logo, a stylized lion's head inside a heart, hung beside the entrance. Jackson pulled up to the intercom and pressed the call button, his stomach knotting as a woman's voice answered, "Wild Heart Sanctuary, how can I help you?" "Jackson Steele, I have an appointment with Dr. Cortez." There was a brief pause. "Yes, Mr. Steele. We've been expecting you. Please pull through and follow the drive to the main building." The gate swung open with a mechanical hum that seemed to signal the final threshold between his life with Fury and whatever came next. Jackson drove through slowly, as if delaying these last few moments could somehow change what was about to happen. The rain had finally stopped, though gray clouds still hung low in the sky. The sanctuary grounds were impressive, sprawling acres of natural habitat divided into large enclosures, each designed to mimic the native environments of its inhabitants. As they passed one such enclosure, Jackson caught sight of a full-grown male lion lounging on a rocky outcropping. The animal's massive size was a stark reminder of what Fury would become, a powerful predator that belonged in a place like this, not on a struggling cattle ranch. The main building was a modern structure of glass and stone that housed the sanctuary's offices and medical facilities. Dr. Elena Cortez was waiting on the covered porch as Jackson parked. She was younger than he had expected, maybe early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the weathered tan of someone who spent most of her time outdoors. "Mr. Steele," she greeted him, extending her hand. "Thank you for making the journey, especially in this weather." Jackson nodded, his throat too tight for words. He shook her hand briefly, then moved to the back of the truck where Fury's carrier sat beneath the now soaked tarp. "Is this our new resident?" Dr. Cortez asked, following him. "This is Fury," Jackson confirmed, pulling back the tarp to reveal the carrier. Inside, the cub was pressed against the far corner, his amber eyes wary as he assessed the new surroundings and stranger. Dr. Cortez crouched to peer into the carrier, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "He's beautiful," she said softly, "and bigger than I expected from your photos. How old did you estimate he is?" "Emmett, the man I got him from, said he was about 3 months when I took him in. That was almost 2 months ago, so 5 months, give or take." Dr. Cortez nodded, making notes on a tablet she carried. "And his temperament? You mentioned he was aggressive initially." "He was," Jackson agreed, remembering those first difficult weeks. "Tried to take my hand off more than once, but he's different now. Still has his moments, but mostly he's just..." He struggled to find the right word. "Curious, playful, smart as hell." "And attached to you," Dr. Cortez observed, noting how Fury's eyes remained fixed on Jackson even as they discussed him. "That's both good and challenging. It means he's capable of forming bonds, but it also means the transition will be harder for him." 2 staff members approached with a specially designed transport cart. "We'll take him to the assessment area now," Dr. Cortez explained. "We need to check his physical condition, run some tests, and begin the quarantine process before introducing him to our other residents." The reality of the moment hit Jackson with crushing force. This was it, the last few minutes he would spend with Fury. Soon the cub would be taken away, examined by strangers, placed in an unfamiliar environment where Jackson couldn't comfort him during storms or scratch that special spot behind his ear that made him close his eyes in contentment. "Can I?" His voice broke. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Can I have a minute with him first?" Dr. Cortez studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Of course. We'll give you some privacy." She gestured for the staff to step back, then moved away herself, leaving Jackson alone with the carrier. He knelt beside it, opening the door to reach inside. Fury immediately pushed forward to press against his hand, a soft rumbling sound in his throat that wasn't quite a purr but conveyed recognition and trust. "Hey, buddy," Jackson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is your new home. These people are going to take good care of you, give you space to run, food to eat, maybe even friends of your own kind someday." Fury butted his head against Jackson's palm, then suddenly lunged forward, escaping the carrier to launch himself into Jackson's arms, much as he had during the storm. The cub's weight, significantly greater than when Jackson had first brought him home, nearly knocked him backward. Fury pressed his face against Jackson's neck, his hot breath tickling the rancher's skin. "I know," Jackson murmured, wrapping his arms around the cub. "I don't want this either." From a few yards away, Dr. Cortez watched the interaction with a mixture of professional concern and genuine empathy. This was not the typical case of a well-intentioned but misguided exotic pet owner. The bond between the man and lion was unusual, profound in a way that gave her pause. "Mr. Steele," she called softly, approaching again. "It's time." Jackson nodded, not trusting himself to speak. With gentle but firm hands, he disengaged Fury's claws from his shirt and guided the reluctant cub back into the carrier. Fury resisted, growling his displeasure, but eventually allowed himself to be secured once more. The staff returned with the transport cart. Together with Jackson, they lifted the carrier onto it, securing it with straps for the journey into the building. Fury's eyes never left Jackson's face, his expression a mixture of confusion and what looked disturbingly like betrayal. "Will you—" Jackson began, then stopped, unsure what he was even asking for. Dr. Cortez seemed to understand anyway. "You're welcome to call for updates on his progress," she said kindly. "And once he's settled, perhaps in a few months you might visit. Though I should warn you that sometimes visits from former caretakers can be more disruptive than helpful for the animal's adjustment." A few months. The words echoed hollowly in Jackson's mind. A few months ago, he hadn't even known Fury existed. Now the thought of not seeing him for that long felt like a physical pain in his chest. As the staff began wheeling the cart toward the building, Fury finally reacted. A sound erupted from the cub, not a growl or a roar, but a desperate, plaintive cry that seemed to contain all the confusion and fear he couldn't express any other way. He pawed at the carrier door, his eyes locked on Jackson with an intensity that made the rancher take an involuntary step forward. "It's better if you don't follow," Dr. Cortez said gently, placing a restraining hand on Jackson's arm. "The longer the goodbye, the harder it is for both of you." Jackson sat in his truck in the sanctuary parking lot for nearly an hour, unable to bring himself to start the engine and leave. Fury's cries still echoed in his ears, a sound he suspected would haunt his dreams for months to come. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, as if holding on to the last physical connection to the cub. "It's for the best," he told himself aloud, the words hollow in the empty cab. "He's where he belongs." But if that was true, why did it feel so wrong? Eventually, as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the parking lot, Jackson forced himself to turn the key. The engine rumbled to life, its familiar sound offering no comfort today. He backed out slowly, taking one last look at the sanctuary buildings where Fury was now beginning his new life. Then he pointed the truck west and began the long journey home. The drive back seemed to take twice as long as the journey there, each mile stretching endlessly before him. The radio remained off. Jackson couldn't bear the thought of music or cheerful voices from DJs who knew nothing of what he'd just lost. The silence was broken only by the sound of the tires on asphalt and the occasional rattle of something loose in the truck bed. It was well past midnight when Jackson finally turned onto the dirt road leading to the broken spur. The ranch looked exactly as he had left it that morning, yet somehow different, emptier despite nothing having changed except the absence of one small lion cub. He parked in front of the cabin but remained in the truck, suddenly reluctant to go inside and face the spaces where Fury should be. The worn leather armchair the cub had claimed as his favorite spot, the kitchen where he'd watched Jackson cook with curious eyes, the bedroom where they'd weathered storms together. When Jackson finally dragged himself from the truck and into the cabin, the silence hit him like a physical blow. No eager greeting, no soft growl of recognition, no weight pressing against his leg as he moved through the rooms. He stood in the center of the main room, surrounded by evidence of Fury's presence. A chewed boot by the door, claw marks on the sofa arm, a few golden hairs on the blanket tossed over his chair. Sleep eluded him that night. He lay on his bed, acutely aware of the empty space beside him where Fury had slept these past weeks. Every creak of the old cabin, every whisper of wind outside the windows seemed to carry echoes of the cub's presence. Morning brought no relief, only the stark reality of a new routine. Jackson went through the motions of his daily chores, feeding the cattle, checking fences, repairing equipment, with mechanical precision and none of his usual energy. The work that had once given him purpose now felt meaningless, just tasks to fill the hours until night fell again. 3 days after returning from the sanctuary, Jackson finally called Dr. Cortez for an update. Her voice was professionally kind, as she reported that Fury was physically healthy but still adjusting to his new environment. "He's not eating as much as we'd like," she admitted. "And he's been somewhat aggressive with staff. It's not unusual for new arrivals, especially those with strong attachments to their previous caretakers." Jackson closed his eyes, picturing Fury pacing an unfamiliar enclosure, confused and angry at his abandonment. Does he seem unhappy?" There was a pause on the line. "I wouldn't frame it that way, Mr. Steele. He's adapting. It takes time." The non-answer told Jackson everything he needed to know. "When can I visit him?" "I think we should give it at least a month," Dr. Cortez replied carefully. "Visits too soon can disrupt the adjustment process. We're trying to help him establish new routines, new relationships with our staff, and eventually with other lions." A month seemed like an eternity. "Right," Jackson said, his voice rough. "I understand." After hanging up, he stood on the porch watching the sun set over his land. In the distance, he could see the boundary where his property met Blackwood's larger ranch, the very land the wealthy rancher had been so determined to acquire. As if summoned by the thought, Blackwood's luxury SUV appeared on the horizon, dust billowing behind it as it approached along the connecting road. Jackson straightened, a flicker of the old fire returning to his eyes. He'd been expecting this visit since returning from the sanctuary. Blackwood pulled up with his usual arrogant confidence, stepping from the vehicle in his spotless boots and crisp shirt that had never seen a day's honest work. "Steele," he called, approaching the porch. "Sheriff Mercer tells me your little zoo exhibit is gone. Smart decision." Jackson remained where he was, looking down at Blackwood from the porch steps. "What do you want?" "Just checking if you've reconsidered my offer now that the complication has been removed." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Life's simpler without illegal predators on your property, isn't it?" The casual cruelty of the remark ignited something in Jackson's chest, a burning anger that cut through the fog of grief that had surrounded him since leaving Fury. This man had used the cub as leverage, had reported him to the sheriff, had tried to manipulate the situation to force Jackson off his land. "My answer hasn't changed," Jackson said, his voice deadly quiet. "This ranch isn't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone." Blackwood's false smile faded. "Don't be a fool, Steele. You're barely keeping this place afloat. One bad season, one missed payment to the bank, and you'll lose it all anyway." "Maybe," Jackson conceded, "but it'll be my choice, not yours." He descended the porch steps until he stood eye to eye with Blackwood. "Now get off my property." For a moment, tension crackled between them like lightning before a storm. Then Blackwood stepped back, his expression hardening into something ugly. "You'll regret this," he said. "When the bank forecloses and you're left with nothing, remember I offered you a way out." "I'll take my chances," Jackson replied, not backing down. After Blackwood left, kicking up dust with his unnecessarily fast departure, Jackson felt something he hadn't experienced since returning from the sanctuary, a sense of purpose. If Blackwood wanted the broken spur so badly, then by God, Jackson would make sure he never got it. He would fight for this land with everything he had, not just for himself or for his father's memory, but for what it represented: independence, determination, the right to chart his own course. The confrontation had sparked something else too, a realization that had been forming in the back of his mind since watching Fury being wheeled away at the sanctuary. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Some bonds couldn't be broken by distance or circumstance. That night, Jackson sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, researching everything he could find about sanctuary protocols, lion behavior, and the legal requirements for working with big cats. If he couldn't bring Fury home, and he knew that was impossible, perhaps there was another solution, one that would allow him to remain part of the cub's life while ensuring Fury received the care and environment he needed. 2 weeks after leaving Fury at the sanctuary, Jackson received an unexpected call from Dr. Cortez. Her voice was tight with professional concern. "Mr. Steele, we're having some issues with Fury that I think we need to discuss." Jackson's heart jumped into his throat. "Is he hurt? Sick?" "No, nothing like that," she assured him. "Physically, he's fine, but his behavior is unusual. He's refusing food from most of our staff, barely sleeping, and showing signs of extreme stress. When we attempted to introduce him to our youngest female cub yesterday, he reacted with aggression that went beyond normal territorial behavior." Jackson closed his eyes, picturing Fury alone and confused, lashing out at strangers. "What are you saying?" There was a long pause on the line. "In my professional opinion, Fury may not be suitable for integration into our sanctuary population. Some animals, particularly those who form intense bonds with humans during critical developmental periods, simply don't adapt to more natural environments." "So what happens to him?" Jackson asked, though he already feared the answer. "We have several options," Dr. Cortez said carefully. "We could continue trying different approaches, perhaps with a longer adjustment period. We could consider transferring him to a facility that specializes in difficult cases. Or—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Jackson knew the unspoken option: euthanasia for an animal too dangerous to release and too maladjusted to live among its own kind. "I'd like to come see him," Jackson said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. I know I initially advised against early visits, but at this point I think it might be helpful for both of you. Perhaps seeing you would give us insights into his behavior that could guide our next steps." Jackson was in his truck before the call ended, throwing together a hastily packed overnight bag and enough supplies for the long drive. As he sped down the highway toward the sanctuary, his mind raced with possibilities. What if Fury couldn't adapt? What if the sanctuary couldn't keep him? The thought of the cub being put down because Jackson had tried to do the right thing was unbearable. He arrived at Wildheart just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sanctuary grounds. "Doctor." Cortez met him at the gate, her face showing the strain of dealing with a difficult case. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, leading him toward a building separate from the main facility. "We've moved Fury to our assessment unit. It's quieter there, away from the other animals." Through a viewing window, Jackson finally saw Fury again. The cub was pacing restlessly in a spacious enclosure designed to mimic a natural habitat with rocks, logs, and vegetation. But Fury seemed oblivious to his surroundings, moving back and forth along the same path he had clearly been traveling for hours. "He's been doing that almost constantly," Dr. Cortez explained. "Barely stops to eat or drink. It's a stress behavior we sometimes see in captive big cats, but it's unusual in one so young." Jackson placed his hand against the glass, a painful tightness in his chest. "Can I go in?" Dr. Cortez hesitated. It's against our protocols to allow visitors inside enclosures. I'm not a visitor, Jackson said quietly. And he's not just any lion. After a long moment, Dr. Cortez nodded. We'll take precautions. Our staff will be ready to intervene if necessary. Minutes later, equipped with a radio and emergency protocols, Jackson stood at the door to Fury's enclosure. Dr. Cortez unlocked it, her expression still conflicted. Be careful, she warned. He may not react the way you expect. He's been through a lot of changes. Jackson stepped into the enclosure, his heart hammering against his ribs. Fury continued pacing, apparently unaware of his presence. Then the cub froze, his head lifting as he caught Jackson's scent. For a terrible moment, he didn't move, just stared with an intensity that made Jackson wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake. Hey, buddy, Jackson said softly. Remember me? What happened next would be seared into Jackson's memory forever. Fury launched himself across the enclosure with explosive speed, covering the distance between them in seconds. Behind him, Jackson heard Dr. Cortez's sharp intake of breath, the click of a tranquilizer gun being readied. But instead of attacking, Fury skidded to a stop at Jackson's feet. Then, with a sound that was half growl, half whimper, the cub pressed himself against Jackson's legs, his entire body vibrating with emotion. Jackson dropped to his knees, and Fury immediately climbed into his lap just as he had during storms at the ranch. The cub's weight, noticeably greater after 2 weeks, nearly toppled Jackson backward. Fury pressed his face against Jackson's neck, breathing in his scent, as if to confirm this wasn't some cruel trick. I missed you too, Jackson whispered, his voice breaking as he wrapped his arms around the trembling cub. For several minutes they remained like that, reunited in a moment that defied all rational explanations of animal behavior. When Jackson finally looked up, he found Dr. Cortez watching them with an expression of professional amazement. In 20 years of working with big cats, she said slowly, I've never seen anything like this. The next hour was spent in deep discussion about Fury's future. Dr. Cortez was blunt about the realities. Fury had imprinted on Jackson to a degree that made traditional sanctuary life nearly impossible for him. The cub's aggressive reactions to staff and other lions weren't just territorial. They were the responses of an animal who had formed an attachment that transcended normal behavioral patterns. So what are our options? Jackson asked. Dr. Cortez considered carefully before answering. There's a program we've been developing for cases like this, though I've never seen one quite so extreme. It's a specialized sanctuary staff training model where the animal's primary attachment figure becomes part of the care team. You mean I would work here? Jackson asked, surprised. Not necessarily full-time, at least not initially, but you would be involved in Fury's care, helping train our staff to work with him, gradually transitioning him to accept others while maintaining the bond that's clearly crucial to his well-being. It was a solution Jackson hadn't dared to hope for, a way to remain part of Fury's life while ensuring he received proper care from professionals. But there was still one major obstacle. My ranch is 6 hours from here, he said. I can't just abandon it. Dr. Cortez nodded, understanding. These arrangements are complex, but perhaps we could start with regular visits, maybe twice a week, while we develop a longer-term plan. As they talked, Fury remained pressed against Jackson's side, occasionally nudging his hand when the petting stopped. The cub's transformation was remarkable, from the stressed, pacing animal they had observed earlier to this content, almost relaxed creature. Exactly 2 months, Jackson said suddenly. Pardon? And Dr. Cortez looked confused. It's been exactly 2 months since I bought him for 50 cents. Jackson shook his head, still amazed by the journey that had brought them here. Never would have believed it would lead to this. By the time Jackson left the sanctuary that evening, with plans to return in 3 days, he had the beginnings of a new future mapped out. The broken spur would remain his, a defiant stand against Blackwood's ambitions. But his life would now be divided between the ranch and the sanctuary, between his heritage and this unexpected bond that had changed everything. As he drove home under a canopy of stars, Jackson reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 2 months ago, he had impulsively spent 50 cents on an aggressive lion cub that everyone, including himself, had thought was a mistake. Now that same cub had given his solitary existence new purpose, new connections, new possibilities he could never have imagined. Some investments, it seemed, paid dividends that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents.